Welcome to another edition of the Joshua Vandernoord Show. I regret to inform you, today's show is not live. It will not be a typical show. This is pre-recorded, but it's a very special show because, as I've mentioned before, I mentioned last week, the Joshua Vandernoord Show originally was on radio. It started as my own radio show. I did Saturday mornings at my current mode of employment, but it got canceled because I'm anti-Semitic. I'm not anti-Semitic. I love God's chosen people, even though they don't currently occupy the nation state of Israel. So with that being said, this is actually a show that aired over a year ago, but there's something very, very special about it. So I thought I would share it with you guys, because let's be honest, a lot of you guys are coming over here from outside the Overton, where Zeb and I co-host that said show outside the Overton. And I wanted to share this episode of the Joshua Vandernoord Show with you because this is actually the first time that Zeb and myself appeared together in any sort of entertainment format. And I got to be honest, I don't remember. Zeb and I barely knew each other at the time. We met because the main show that I produced, that's my current job, he was a listener of. He would call in. He was clearly on the same page as me as a bunch of issues. Like me and the host at the time, we were debating Christian nationalism a lot, and Zeb would kind of come in and back me up on things like that. And so he and I kind of built up a rapport when I would call screen. We ended up getting lunch together one time, we got to talking about politics and stuff like that. Really going back to about a year ago, fun stuff. And I asked him to come on my show so we could talk about Thomas Jefferson, Christian nationalism, Alexander Hamilton, all that kind of stuff. So this is said show. But without further ado, we're going to get right into it. Welcome to the Joshua Vandernoord Show. I am your host, Joshua Vandernoord. Happy to be with you guys to hear again on Saturday. But to get right into it, because we got a special timetable here, I'm with Zeb Dowry.
Boykin.
Dowry, where'd I get that from? Zeb Boykin. You probably heard earlier this week, Ken and I get into a debate over essentially Christian nationalism versus the so-called democratic republic that we have today. I'm not a fan of it. And so, of course, I wanted to have some other thoughts on it. I got someone who almost completely agrees with me to come on the show. Zeb, how you doing?
Doing good. Well, thank you for having me, and good morning to everybody out there.
Appreciate you coming on. So you're a listener of Wake Up Carolina, right?
I am. I guess you could call me a new resident of Florence. Been here a little less than a year and been listening to Kim for a little while. Found your show, so
okay. So
glad to be here.
How did you hear about Wake Up Carolina?
You know, word gets out. Florence isn't that small, but it has that small town feel. So here we are.
Yeah, I've talked with Ken. He said he's bumped into you a few times at the gym. Is that what you do?
I frequent the gym a little bit. Ken's got a little age on him, but he stays active and he tries to keep up with us younger boys.
Yeah. I hear you. That's funny. So did you? We're kind of not on topic right now, but I'm just kind of personally curious. Did you know? Did you hear about the show before you met him in person, or vice versa?
No, I've known about Ken. I've been interested in politics for a little while now, and Ken is the face of politics around here, pretty much. So, yeah, I've known about Ken. I've never really listened to the show until recently, but I have a decent grasp of him. Some of his policies, where he stands, and his I would call it more libertarian leaning than we have.
Yeah. And that's a point of I don't know if contention's the right word, but point of disagreement that me and Ken have on the show. A lot of these, and this is not. I try not to fall into the generational insults to this sort of generational distinction, but I will just say that is something I found to be kind of a boomer mentality.
Yeah, there's obviously a generational gap here. And I don't want, we don't need to sling mud at each other. But at the same time, we have to recognize where we are, what has been brought about by policies of the past. and we have to move on from that and adjust. We can't keep, let's say, we can't keep pushing this constitutionalism that has brought us to where we are. We can get into it in a little bit, but, I would claim that the Constitution is a dead document. You have over half of your elected officials that don't even hold it to authority. At the same time, if we enacted what the Founding Fathers perceived as a Constitution today, we would still end up in the same place, and probably less time than we have, the 250 years that we have since then. So.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's a good point to bring up, because this reminds me of something I brought up with Ken the other day. I can't remember if it was on or off the air. Maybe since you were listening, you can remind me. But I was asking Ken, because he talks about how he thinks that the Constitution is a divinely inspired document, and that America has been sort of blessed with this divine status over other nations, which me personally, I don't agree with. I'm not saying that God has not used America or won't continue to use America for his ends, but what I said was, do you think that America, God gave this sort of distinction to America because what the Founding Fathers came up with was so good? I don't think so. And what I specifically mentioned to him was, if the Founding Fathers could have seen into the future up till this point, up till 2024 alone, forget what happens next, would they have kept the Constitution exactly the way it was? And Ken said no, which I agree with. I don't think the Founding Father, I think they would have enshrined way more into law. They would have probably kept a couple things that are in there out if they had seen what is to come, which to me shows it's not divinely inspired.
Yeah, I don't know how you can claim it's divinely inspired. Maybe there's a mix-up of definitions there, or a conflating.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that he puts it on the same par as the Bible.
Right, but when we say divinely inspired, at least I do. I mean divinely inspired. Right, as the Word of God is. The Constitution as it stands now is almost been amended to the point of non-recognition, but again, like I mentioned just a second ago, the Constitution is almost perceived as divinely inspired, almost taking the place of Scripture itself, and that is a generational thing that I've noticed. We have constitutional libertarians, we have constitutional liberals, and we have constitutional conservatives. They don't all believe the same thing, but they all hold the Constitution to that sole authority over civil law. But at the end of the day, if you establish the Constitution as it is, even if you establish it as is today, you still end up in the same place that we are, where we have mass migration, we have insane inflation, and we have government overreach of almost bordering tyranny, which I would argue is tyranny. We still end up at the same place. The logical conclusion is always going to be the same if you enact the Constitution as is.
Yeah, I get that, and I generally agree with you. So to me, and this is kind of an off the cuff thing. I asked you to come in because we have each other's phone numbers. We were texting during the show that I was talking about this with Ken. So let me ask you, which route would you prefer to go down right now? Would you prefer to go down, we discuss maybe the failings of democracy as shown in how it works today, or just jump right into the Christian nationalism topic and why that's maybe superior?
Yeah, we can kind of talk about the idea of democracy, and even like the Founding Fathers would agree with the statement that democracy has failed. The vast majority of them, even Jefferson, as progressive as he was for the time, would agree that a multicultural state cannot govern through democracy. It just cannot happen. It becomes, people call it mob rule. You can call it whatever you will, but factions will be divided on culture. And at that point, it becomes which culture has the majority. And so your democracy or democratic republic, however you want to call it, is basically the same thing as if you're represented by said culture, they are voted in by that culture. I would think that the Founding Fathers would agree that democracy has failed as a multicultural state and has basically removed the soul of America in doing so.
Yeah, and that's something to point out, because you sent me a quote from Jefferson written in it was like the Virginia Declaration or something like that. I don't quite remember, and maybe you can pull it up in a second. I'll talk till then. But basically, I agree, and the founding fathers agreed, is a huge problem with democracy is that how it is operating now is not at all how the founding fathers intended. In the Federalist Paper too, and this is not an exact quote, I'm almost certainly butchering it, but John Jay, he talks about how a democracy is only possible when it is people of a same ancestry, people of a same culture, people of a same race, people of a same religion working together, people of a similar community. You're going to have minor disagreements within a community, but still just one community, one sense of personhood, one sense of community, ultimately discussing minor disagreements. When you have vastly different cultures, vastly different religions, all opining over the same vote, over vastly different opinions, that's how you get where we are today, where the country is divided 50-50.
Yeah,
which ultimately is unsustainable.
Well, it's divided up basically 50, and then you have your groups beyond that. But you mentioned Hamilton writing in reference to Jefferson's own notes on Virginia. Hamilton said, "Foreigners will generally be apt to bring with them attachments to the persons they have left behind, to the country of their own nativity, and to its particular customs and manners." He also argued, "It is unlikely that they will bring with them the temperament of love, liberty, so essential to real republicanism." And Hamilton, referencing Jefferson, is arguing that basically assimilation is not real. And I would agree with that to an extent. I would say it takes 3 to 4 generations to have some type of to embed a soul into a family through generation, the American soul, let's say. And so the question is, what is assimilation? And I would argue that the assimilation of today is not the same assimilation of a pre-war culture. The assimilation into America today is, flying the rainbow flag at the White House. The assimilation today is the institutions that of education that we have that are imbuing our kids with, basically communism and Marxism, as we have on the DNC platform. So the question is, what are we assimilating to? And then we can kind of get into maybe, that Christian nationalism, or we can call it cultural Christianity loosely. What is that assimilation? What are we trying to assimilate these people into? But back to Hamilton, when you have immigration of foreigners, and they were in reference to the French, they were in reference to the Netherlands and Ireland, and not necessarily even Asians, East Asians, South Asians, or Africans, right? So they were specifically in response to whites beyond what would be considered waspian.
Yeah, and that's an interesting and dangerous point to bring up, but it is important because that is in essence what the founding fathers meant. And Ken, he talked about it, I think today, it may have been yesterday, I don't quite remember, but he was talking about, I think it was yesterday, he was squaring away or an issue he had problem squaring away with was, if America was divinely created, if the Constitution is divinely inspired, how could the founding fathers be okay with something like the institution of slavery? And to me, the answer is simple. The answer is because it's not divinely inspired. And there's other, topics about the Bible, but we won't get into the slavery discussion. But to me, it does fundamentally go back to this. The nation itself is an experiment. Everyone says it's an experiment, and to me, it has failed because, like we're talking about, this sort of multicultural immigration, this degradation of the morals of the Christian morality that was, regardless of what Jefferson says, regardless of Jefferson being a deist, the Christianity was at the forefront of what made this country what it is.
Absolutely. And I think we have to separate the founding of the country and what the country was or is.
Right.
Cultural Christianity is a term that's tossed around a lot, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but I do understand it, that America was a Christian nation at the founding, without question. But I would also argue that America wasn't founded as a Christian nation. And I would get some pushback for that, which is fine.
And I'd actually agree with you on this.
America was founded on a deist. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had the vast influence in the founding of America, on at least on the philosophical grounds. So America was a Christian country at the founding of, somewhere close to 98% being Protestant, where you have maybe an objection like Maryland that was Catholic. So each state had imbued their own constitution of Christ is king, essentially. They acknowledged that the Trinity was the truth. And so when we get away from that on the founding, it is no longer a Christian country, but then a theist country, or you could argue deist, depending on where you see Jefferson at. So, the founding of the country being Christian and the country being Christian itself is not the same. You even have people like Elon Musk and Richard Dawkins that will say that they are cultural Christians, right? Richard Dawkins is an ardent atheist and has basically admitted that he will never accept Christ, even if he comes to him outrightly. He'll deny it and say it's a hallucination. But he will accept that he is a cultural Christian. Why? Because the application of Christianity within a culture is the greatest culture that can exist. And some cultures are simply better than others.
Yeah.
And so when you have an atheist, as ardent as Richard Dawkins is, come out and say that he is a cultural Christian, why do you not then follow up with, maybe we should be a Christian nation? If the application of the ideology is the ideal, why can't we create the ideal through application? Does that make sense?
Yes. And that's essentially because here's what I think about like conservative political talk radio and just like media in general right now. I think media serves a very valuable purpose within a society. I mean, obviously, the manipulation of media manipulates the public. Most people...
No.
Well,
just kidding.
Yeah. Most people don't comb through the data. Most people don't read all these books that you're recommending to me, read all this. They're not really diving deep beyond surface level into the information. So the point is media operates at the surface level. Most people's political opinions come from what they see on television. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, obviously, would society be a better place if people did comb through the data? 100%. Are people going to do that? Absolutely not. So my point is, I think that what we're doing right now serves some sort of benefit to those people listening if we're right. So I have all these opinions and you have all these opinions about how society should be. And that's really what we're trying to do here. What I'm trying to accomplish here with you is I'm trying to get people to change their minds and question what they've thought maybe their entire lives, no matter how old they are. Where an issue I ran into in 2016 was, I, of course, know about the Founding Fathers. Do I have this encyclopedic knowledge of them? And honestly, my knowledge of the Founding Fathers and the founding of this nation was very surface level back then. But I respected it and revered it because I'm an American. Nowadays, you're seeing a vast majority of people turning away from that. And I think that the for every action, there is a equal and opposite reaction, right? So you get all these Democrats, all these social liberals who are clearly, they don't respect the Constitution. They don't care about the founding. If they had it their way, it would be completely changed and overridden, whether or not they say it out loud or not. You know what I mean? And so the opposite reaction that you see on the side of the the Republicans or the conservatives or the Christians is they want to prop up the founding fathers. They want to basically revere them, I think, a little bit more than they should be, as opposed to saying just because people are having a negative reaction to them doesn't mean we should overly positivize, them.
Yeah. And in that same vein, I mentioned the Constitution basically takes the place of the Scripture.
Right.
And
yes,
in doing so, you also replace what would be the apostles or the disciples as the founding fathers.
Yes.
And so we revere them as though they are that. And that's obviously a mistake. And it seems like there's a generational gap there, as mentioned earlier. And I don't know how to fix that without being blunt, because what we're after is the truth, or at least it should be. And to get to the truth, you have to question everything. You have to question even what you do perceive to be true. And I think that's the end goal. And if that is the end goal, then we reach Christianity, and then we reach a application of Christianity within civil law and civil order to the good of God through earthly means. And that fixes itself in, I would argue, what Stephen Wolfe describes as Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and maybe we'll get into what his definition of that is here in a second, but I would say that is an important thing. And really, I think if I could reach out to any audience, if you could say your show will be completely heard by everyone in a certain demographic, you just have to pick what that demographic is, I would say people under the age of 25 or under the age of 35 ideally, but whatever. As opposed to people that are already Christian or whatnot, because to me, I respect my elders, but they are on their way out. So a lot of the people that listen to Wake Up Carolina, a lot of the people that listen to this radio station aren't exactly my target demographic. But my point is you get these people that say, we just need to go back to the Constitution. If people just respected the Constitution, everything would be better. Wrong. I don't think that's true, because people 50 years ago respected the Constitution, and look where that got us. And I'm not saying that circumstance happened in a vacuum. There are outside factors. There's World War I, there's World War II. There's all sorts of things happening behind the scenes. But my point is that, like you were just saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but because I think we definitely agree on this, what should be held in more reverence? Scripture, God's Word, or the Constitution? To me, that's an easy question. God's Word.
It's definitely an easy question. And I'm not saying they are replacing it, but there is a authority given to the Constitution that I don't think should be, at least not today. Maybe 50 years ago in a pre-war culture that hasn't been perverted through radical individualism of the 60s, the sexual revolution, and then on into the 90s and 2000s, and then the deterioration of something like law enforcement in the early 10s, up until today, where, again, you have major sodomy parades parading through some of the largest cities and live televised throughout the country, right? This is not the same country culturally or through law, through civil order, as it was pre-war. If I could go and repeal the 20th century, we could, in the Fed, we could start there, and then later on into what I've mentioned. But again, we have to recognize where we are. We can't go back in time. We have to recognize where we are, how we got here. And like Ken mentioned this morning, we're filming on Wednesday, that, we can point the finger all we want, but that doesn't solve the issue. There's a lot of people at fault, and a lot of our generation, maybe your generation more so than mine, would like to point the finger at the older generation, and the older generation would like to point the finger at the younger generation. That's just how it works. That's how it's always worked. That's how it's always going to work. But we have to recognize where we are and how to fix the issues that we have. primarily issues of economy, immigration, inflation. And so, we kind of got to move forward from there. And I don't think the way forward is to look back on the Constitution of 250 years ago. Even the founding fathers understood that the Constitution, they weren't expecting it to last 20 years, much less 250. So
yeah, I completely agree. We got to take a break though, so we'll continue this conversation on the other side. I'm your host Joshua Vandernoord here with Zeb. We'll be right back in just a few minutes. Welcome back to the Joshua Vandernoord Show. I'm your host Joshua Vandernoord. On with Zeb, we're discussing Christian nationalism and the founding fathers. So I want to respond to what you said in the last segment before our break. You were talking about generational blame. And something you said that I think is incredibly profound and I think needs to be said is the younger generation pointing the blame at the older generation and the older generation pointing the blame at the younger generation. That has been going on forever. That is not something that is new and something that just started happening in the last couple decades. And I think that, yes, there's a lot to complain about with my generation, with Gen Z. Gen Z, they're totally, well, not totally, but a lot of them are hyper acceptant of these sort of weird sexual deviancies, these weird, pronouns, transgenderism. They're all completely, for the most part, a lot of the more liberal sided part of Gen Z has bought into the wokeness. But where did the ball get rolling on that? You can't just go from this sort of 1950s, this standard, the nuclear family, and then the next day get to that. It was built on with like you said, the sexual revolution, all these other social programs, so to speak, that have been. We don't get to where we are without a foundation, and that foundation came from the older generations. And I'm not even bringing that up to, like I said, it almost sounds like I'm blaming it on them. I'm not. But the point is, kind of tying it back into our whole discussion of today about Christian nationalism as opposed to democracy, is we have to be able to be introspective. I can say, and you and me had lunch or dinner a few weeks ago, and we were talking about this. We were talking about how most people don't think about why they think the way they do. Most people don't analyze themselves. They only point their analytical abilities out at other people. And I try to do that. No one's perfect. Everyone's got biases. But I think you and I are the type of person, and Ken is too. I give Ken a lot of credit for this because I've got members of my family, a lot of people that call into my show and Ken's show. You can just tell when you're looking at them or when you're hearing them speak, they didn't listen to a single word you said. They heard what they wanted to hear, and the whole time you were talking, they're formulating their response, not actually trying to listen to what you're saying. And again, hot take over here. This is not something new, but my point is if people become more introspective, if people are willing to listen to what I'm saying, to what you're saying, and really think about why they think the way they do, I think they'll understand that if they're a Christian, because this is not going to resonate with someone who's an atheist or a Muslim, but if you're listening and you're a Christian, I think if you really listen to what we're saying, you would understand we're not putting down the founding fathers. We're not discarding the Constitution, but we are saying that what would make the country better? Would it be if it was a bunch of atheist homosexuals that all got along and were voting democratically in completely upholding the Constitution? Would that be a perfect place to live? I still don't think so. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Yeah,
and we like to group the founding fathers all in one basket,
right?
And they weren't. There was much animosity between Jefferson and Hamilton. Almost on every issue, there was some stressor between them that they disagreed on. So let's say, for instance, Hamilton was what we would call today as a nationalist, and Jefferson would have been considered a anti-federalist, but he would be considered a federalist today. There's a little bit of nuance in between vocabulary 200 years ago and today. But Jefferson was a laissez-faire, very Kennard type of libertarian, and he advocated for that. And Hamilton was very much a nationalist that wished for the country to have a centralized soul, let's say. He wanted centralized government. Jefferson wanted decentralized government. Jefferson wanted to have the republic that he got, and Hamilton wanted to have more of a governorship type setup, almost mirroring a monarchy, but not necessarily so. Today we would call something like that in the Christian nationalism a Christian prince, a governor's rule that is bound by the authority of God, as the Bible is, advocates for. All authority given in the world is given by God. And there's a quote that goes, "The people ruled by a woman is seeing a damnation by God," let's say. So, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but it gets to the point of bad rulers are what comes to a nation that cannot rule itself.
Right.
And so, we see people like Hamilton, Jefferson, they're fighting back and forth on almost every issue. We can call back to when Dr. Bolt, sorry.
Yeah.
When Dr. Bolt was in here maybe 2 weeks ago talking about the Louisiana Purchase, and he was correct on Jefferson wanting to sell, acres of land at $1 for, he was an agriculturalist. He wanted the country to be an agricultural country, to have independence. And then Hamilton wanted, he argued that Hamilton wanted an industrialized country, but I would argue that Hamilton wanted a slow growth country to remain a nation itself, to have a self-identity as a nation and not necessarily expand to a point of separation, which I think we can see what came about Jefferson's selling of the land at $1 and the expansion of the U.S. to the point of separation. There's an obvious difference between the West Coast and the East Coast today, and I would drag that back to Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase and the expansion.
Okay, that's an interesting thought, and we'll continue that. I want to, we got to take a break here, but we'll continue this conversation on the other side. This is the Joshua Vandernoord Show. I'm on with Zeb, and we'll be right back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Joshua Vandernoord Show. I'm your host, Joshua Vandernoord. Me and Zeb are talking about Christian nationalism and the sort of distinction between the Jeffersonian point of view and the Hamiltonian point of view, the political theories of both these great men, two founding fathers. And we're gonna continue that conversation. I want to kind of save that till after our next break, which is that will lead into the next hour. So, because I got a couple specific questions I want to ask you about the Jeffersonian Hamiltonian distinction, but to kind of use this last about 7 minutes before we wrap up top of the hour, I want to put a bow a little bit, and we can harken back, but I want to put a little bit of a bow on the Christian nationalism point of view. It's a big topic. It's an interesting topic, and we could definitely talk for a lot more than just an hour on this, but we do got a time restraint. So I guess I want to say, following up what you said in the last segment before our break, you were talking about the Jeffersonian Hamiltonian thing, obviously, but I would say working back to the Christian nationalism thing, we could get into specifics. Really what started this conversation between me and Ken on Wake Up Carolina was this sort of fear, zooming out. I think a lot of the conservative point of view that makes them scared about putting more stock in God's book, as putting more stock in the Bible, as opposed to putting their faith in the Constitution, is this sort of boomer obsession with this big government versus small government thing. A lot of the young Republicans these days, and you're seeing this a lot with people, even Gen Zers that are younger than me, and now even the really hyper-intelligent Gen Alpha, The ones among them that are intelligent is what I'm getting at. You're smirking over there. But you're seeing they're not as afraid of big government. What they want is a big government that reflects their views. And that's kind of what I believe. And I don't know if we disagree or agree on that, but I'm more in favor of a government that is powerful, that is being led by Christian people, because I think that would be a better world. And the example I gave was, I don't know if you partake, but I personally am not a drinker. I don't like alcohol. I don't see alcohol as really contributing to society in of itself. And if I had it my way, alcohol would be completely banned, except for in the context of the Eucharist, of the sacrament. Other than that, I'm not for it.
Yeah, y'all talked about the prohibition.
Yes.
Yesterday? Day before? It
was Tuesday.
Tuesday. Okay, yeah. So, we talked about prohibition. I mean, that would be something that would be considered, if not enacted, under a Christian nationalist society. Right. The banning of alcohol, of drugs in general, for recreation would be towards the better good for the society. Right. Mm-hmm. We can all acknowledge that day drinking is not good for people.
Right.
And so that is basically the foundation of why a Christian nationalism should exist. What is the good of the people for their own good? And even Hamilton acknowledged that the people cannot govern themselves. And he's not saying that the people are idiots or they're just dumb. He's saying that we give in to our human will.
Right.
And we cannot govern ourselves. And so that's what he advocated for. He advocated for a government that is willing to wield the power given to it by God. Other than what we see today, where government is wielding power given to it by God against God. And so we have to recognize that government is going to gain power. It's simply going to happen on a time scale, of 250 years, or we can go ahead and enact it. The question is, how is that power going to be wielded? And so Hamilton and people like Stephen Wolfe and some of these other modern, let's say, polity people that advocate for Christian nationalism understand that wielding the power of the government, whether it's big or small, is or should be oriented towards the good of the people, which would be a perception of what heaven should be like. And so, you mentioned like age, Generation Alpha and the age difference between them and some of the older generation. But, we have to recognize that even, again, the founding fathers had an age gap between them. All of them weren't 60, 70 years old. At the signing of the Declaration, you have Hamilton, that's barely 20 years old. He's 21. And then you have Jefferson, which is 33, 34. And then all the way up to George Washington of 44 and Benjamin Franklin of 70. So we have a large swath of age difference between them. And so I make that point to say that they had a clashing of generations back then.
Right.
But we all group them in the same basket still. And I think we should get away from that. We need to understand the nuances of why the country went the direction it went. And so, that's why we're here today, to distinguish between a Hamiltonian and a Jeffersonian ideal of a country.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get to that in the next hour. We got about a minute before I got to wrap up here, but that's really the crux of the argument, is what system will be better. And to kind of finish the point on prohibition as an example. The thing I hate about being a public speaker essentially is when you have these political opinions, or really you can run in this in everyday life, but especially when it comes to this kind of stuff, and as I'm sure you've experienced, you get the snarky idiots who come up and they say, well, I want the country to be led by Christians. And they're like, well, what kind of Christian? What about Catholics? What about Protestants? What about Lutherans? What about this? What about that? And it's like, that's obviously we can okay, so you want a definition of Christianity? Well, let's define it. And like, for example, prohibition, they talk about, well, if you get rid of alcohol, why not get rid of cheeseburgers? Why not get rid of cigarettes? Why not there's obviously, I think we can say, at this point in time, do we have perfect knowledge about what's good and bad for people? No. Do we understand mostly what's good and bad? Yes. Could you, the audience can't see you, but you're a buff guy. Is it okay for you to have a cheeseburger on a Saturday? 100%. Is it the same thing when a 300-pound person has a cheeseburger on a Saturday? No, it isn't. And that's the thing. I'm not saying that necessarily we can regulate every single aspect of someone's shopping habits. That's not what I'm saying. But can we say cigarettes are bad? They don't bring anything to the table. Why shouldn't we get rid of them?
Yeah, you're basically advocating for a liberty instead of a freedom. And so to differentiate, freedom is the free will of the human to do as he wills.
Yes.
And a liberty is to do as you should, as you ought to. The freedom debate is more of a libertarian stance, and I think that's what Ken advocates for. But I would say that once you become addicted, let's say, to those cheeseburgers, you no longer have the liberty to do as you will. You are then bound by your licentiousness.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where you're getting at. The same thing with prohibition. I'm not saying, we can't have a cheeseburger, but at the same time, if you cannot function because your addiction is eating cheeseburgers, then something needs to happen because you obviously cannot govern yourself, which is what Hamilton advocated for.
Right. And we gotta take a hard break top of the hour, but that's essentially what I'm getting at is it a good thing? Is freedom, to say that I live in a society that's completely free, is that better than, like, if we're living in a completely free society, but people are dying of heart attacks because they're overweight, because they can't control their eating habits, or people are drunk driving or whatever, is it better to say, well, at least we're all free, as opposed to living in a country that is restrictive, but ultimately is promoting good behavior? That's what I'm getting at. But we got to take a hard break, top of the hour. I'm Joshua Vandernoord on with Zeb on the Joshua Vandernoord Show. We'll be right back in just a few minutes. Welcome back to the Joshua Vandernoord Show. I am your host, Joshua Vandernoord, here with Zeb. Zeb, say hi to the folks at home.
How's everyone doing this morning?
Thank you, Zeb. And today we were talking about Christian nationalism. We did some finalizing thoughts on that, I think. But another reason I wanted to have you in here today is because you and I have talked. We've talked before. You've called into Wake Up Carolina, and something I wanted to get your take on, because Dr. Bolt comes on Wake Up Carolina Tuesdays, and he talks with Ken a lot. And my knowledge, admittedly, of the Founding Fathers is very surface level. It's not very in depth, and I kind of regret not reading up on them more. But the past is in the past. So a lot of my exposure to the Jeffersonian Hamiltonian debate is through the lens of Ken and Dr. Bolt's discussions on the air. And admittedly, like I said, I'm not very in depth on it. So when you told me that you take contention with their a lot of what they say, especially with Dr. Bolt being a history teacher, tickle me fancied. I'm a little curious by that. And again, I know you're not a history teacher, but I am curious to hear the dissenting opinion.
Well, I don't know if I would take contention of what they say necessarily. I think there's a slight misrepresentation of Hamilton a few times, and I don't think that's intentional. I think it's a misunderstanding of what Hamilton was actually advocating for. As we mentioned earlier in the show, the Louisiana Purchase, of wanting to maintain Hamilton wanting to maintain a national identity with a slow growth and not rapid expansion, as opposed to Jefferson. It was I think Bolt advocated that Hamilton wanted a industrialization of the Midwest, essentially, or Louisiana Purchase, and yes, partially so. Hamilton did advocate for a industrial society, a a self-sustaining industrial society to where if Hamilton had his way, we would not have China running basically all of our industrial businesses to the United States. So we wouldn't even have that issue, as Ken likes to allude to. Hamilton was an advocate for tariffs. He wanted to create a self-sustaining nation, a nation that had the agriculture, like Jefferson wanted, yes, but also an industrial nation that could separate itself from other nations like Great Britain and England. So Hamilton advocated as a nation for a nation in itself, and Jefferson advocated basically for states within a federation. And so Jefferson generally won out in the end. Obviously, there was, as mentioned earlier, there was an age difference, which I think gave Jefferson a lot of edge to it. But Jefferson was the progressive of the time. He would be the laissez-faire libertarian that Ken says he is, or he says he is naturally inclined to.
Right.
So, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's almost preferable in a society that is guaranteed to be homogenous, that can govern itself. But I don't know if it's possible today, or if we could even get back to something like that, where we could have a Jeffersonian republic of a self-governing society. I just don't know if it's possible, because the early America was, I would say, the ideal of a Christian country, and still we end up where we are today.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That, like, the question I want to ask is, you mentioned how if Hamilton has had his way, we would not be as reliant on China as we are today. If you feel comfortable articulating this, and it might be a too broad of a question, but if Hamilton won as opposed to Jefferson, what might America look like today, other than simply the China thing?
I think we moved,
maybe even socially.
I think we moved towards a more Hamiltonian idea of industrialization throughout the 20th century, up until China took over, let's say the 50s, 60s, and we started importing industrialization into, they like to mention NAFTA. They like to mention a couple of other things that took away from the industrialization of America. But from the founding, Jefferson advocated more of a agricultural society than an industrial society.
Right.
So what would it look like? It's hard to say. I would think that we would be a more self-sustaining nation. We wouldn't be as reliant on other nations, from anything from T-shirts in Indonesia to computer chips in China.
Right.
And so, we're working on speculation here, but once that foundation is there of industrialization, it's hard to get away from, especially if it's going to be your grounding of the GDP of the country. Yeah,
I get that. So I think
maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I guess I was looking for a little bit more specifics, but that's a hard thing to pin down.
Well, you mentioned socially. I would say socially, if we're just looking at the industrialization, I mean, we would probably have a much more if the immigration went the way it did in, let's say, 65, we would have a much more divisive country, because we would be collected around cities more than we even are now. But again, the agriculture is inevitable given the land of the Midwest and
right.
What is brought in during the Louisiana Purchase. I think Jefferson forcing the agricultural society to push and then selling off cheap land and the rapid expansion of a nation destroyed what could have been the soul of the nation, if that makes sense, over time.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I hadn't read about that. I've not really thought about that, but you brought up in the last hour how the Louisiana Purchase essentially is, theoretically, I would.
Well, we can say it's unconstitutional to start with, but
writer of the Constitution.
Jefferson had to work
doing something unconstitutional.
Yeah, Jefferson had to work through a couple things with, as Dr. Bolt mentioned, with the bonds and how the buying of land went, and we weren't even supposed to expand, but we did, and here we are. And Jefferson made it work out however he could. So, it's hard to say, a what if. It's hard to say a what if.
Of course.
But I would like to think that we would be a more cohesive nation had Hamilton had his way in a few of these altercations.
And that's a fair point to make. And from what you've said, because I would imagine essentially the essence of one of the arguments you made about how the Louisiana Purchase ultimately led to this dissociation of American identity. That's why you see such a difference between the East and West Coast. I actually, I tend to agree with you on that, because I think, especially in those days when you don't have rapid communication like we do today, there's multiple factors that aid in developing a culture. And when you have maybe a common ancestry in the 13 American colonies, but that rapidly spreads out west, where communication and social interaction has ultimately been completely cut off, you're going to get these deviations in
culture.
In culture, yeah, which ultimately leads to deviation in morality.
Yeah, so the issue of distance is always going to be one of trying to maintain culture, especially when that culture is cultural Christianity, or even in the case of a Christian nationalist society, that would be difficult to maintain.
Right.
But when you decentralize the government that is supposed to bind everything, it then becomes a lot easier to usurp that cultural aspect of it. And so that's, again, Hamilton advocated for a centralized government, a centralized national authority that would aid in maintaining a national identity through governing authority. And so Jefferson, in contrast, advocated for a decentralized governing authority, or lack thereof, where the people had the choice to do as they will, and we see what we have today. It's echoes of what they advocated for, but it is the logical conclusion.
Yeah, and again, that kind of ties back to our point where in the first hour, where the founding fathers weren't divinely appointed. They weren't divinely inspired. The Constitution is not divinely inspired. These were men who disagreed. These were men who had they had a lot in common, but they also were completely different. And you talk about the age difference. There's the obvious deistic versus theistic views that certain founding fathers had, and that ultimately leads to conflict. And by conflict, I don't mean necessarily war, but this not agreeing on everything. And I guess that would kind of lead me into my next question about the Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian debate. Do you agree with my assessment when I say, if you zoom out far enough, the Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian debate comes down to, it's complicated. And like I said, I'm zooming out very far. Big government versus small government.
We can kind of play semantics a little bit, but
sure,
I would say Hamilton didn't advocate for a big government. I would say he advocated for a strong government.
A strong government.
I think there's a difference there, and I would say Jefferson didn't advocate for a small government, but a hands-off government, more so a government that is decentralized is probably the best way to put it. It governs from afar, let's say,
Okay.
almost a suggestive government, where, as mentioned, Hamilton wanted a more hands-on government, a more, Hamilton wanted a national bank, and he wanted to create independence as a country, as a whole, and not just individual states inside of a federation. So, we can look at something like the EU that has nations within. The EU is essentially a federation.
Mm-hmm.
And they work with each other, but they aren't. The EU isn't. It doesn't really control anything. The nations within the EU did, and that's kind of what Jefferson advocated at the time, was having states within a federation, where the federation didn't really control anything per se, but it did, let's say, suggest states to do things.
Okay, I got you. So kind of tying this back into our whole debate in the first hour, or discussion in the first hour about Christian nationalism, because this is something where, to me personally, I advocate for, if I could have it my way, I would have a big government that has a lot of control, but is ultimately good. And I know that's,
What do you mean when you say big government? Is that number of personnel? Is that
No. I would say that they have more power than our government currently has, even at face value. I mean, obviously, the people of this, you pin every single person who doesn't work for the government against every single person that does. Who's going to win? I think still the government, especially if you count the military in that, which I do. So my point is, like, when I say big government, I mean, and I'm kind of saying that to be provocative, because I'm just so sick of, like, this obsession with minimizing, like, libertarian freedom, not minimizing libertarian freedom, but with this worship of libertarian freedom in of itself. Because to me, as an advocate for Christian nationalism, a lot of the problems we face come from the lack of morals in our society, the social degradation of our society with the sexual revolution and stuff like that, ultimately turning away from God morally. The economic stuff will fix itself if we had a moral society. But the problem is, I don't have faith in the people to all of a sudden, I snap my fingers and now they're all Christian again. So what is the best way to kind of fix our problems? I think by seizing control of the government and radically changing it to become, and then manipulating the law, changing the law to direct society in the way we want it to go. What's going to happen how many people are going to litter if the punishment for littering is you get a finger chopped off every time you're caught doing it? Is this an ideal world where that's the punishment for that level of crime? No. But if the people are doing it and we want them to stop, how are we going to make them stop? Ultimately, I don't think we're going to have a nation of people walking around with 9 fingers, but there's going to be a couple before the message gets across.
Yeah, I think people want change without any repercussions from that change. Change is painful.
And this is a good example of kind of what I mean by that is if Trump legislated that we need to get everyone who came over here illegally in the past 4 years out. We need to round them up. We need to do it peacefully, and we don't want to hurt anybody. Are people going to get hurt in that process?
Yes, people are going to get hurt. One, they're going to refuse. It's going to be forced,
100%.
and then you're going to have feelings get hurt. And feelings getting hurt is the worst thing that could ever happen today.
Well, exactly my point is you have this giant population of people that have come here in the last 4 years, and we want to get them out. Are they going to resist? 100%. But who do you send? You send men with guns. I forget the number, but it's estimated to be over 11 million people have come here within the last 4 years. Out of 11 million people, are there going to be people that resist men with big guns and are going to get shot for it? Yes. Is that a price that I'm willing to pay to get those people out? Yes.
Yeah, I think
that's kind of what I mean.
Well, we have to maintain the nation. And when you have the influx of other nations, you then lose your nation. Naturally, that's just logic flows. You mentioned you wanted to legislate. People make the claim that you can't legislate morality. And I would counter that with you can legislate immorality, right? There's a difference between a positive law and a negative law, right? So let's say a positive law would be something like forcing someone to wear their seatbelt. Mm-hmm. That's a positive law.
Right.
Whereas a negative law would say you cannot do said thing, right? You cannot go loot the store. And I mean, there's a fine line there, but it has to be recognized that we can legislate immorality. If something is bad for the society, it is bad for everyone.
Yes. Yeah. And without getting into the specifics, like how I advocate for prohibition being brought back, without that is like a very niche example, but it does come down to, does a government have the right to say murder is illegal?
Let me ask you this.
Yes. Go ahead.
If there's a law in the books that is not enforced, is it a law?
No.
Right. So we have all these laws on the books, and we have basically a police force that is allowing, maybe not necessarily around here. You know, we have a pretty solid police force around here, but just generally, there's a lack of enforcement of current laws across the nation. And so the question isn't more laws. The question is more enforcement. And how do we get to that? And maybe we can kind of go into how we got to the point of law enforcement not doing their job, if you would like to.
Yes.
Just a little bit away from Hamilton, Jefferson, but
we gotta, that's fine. I'm a big advocate for, we'll see where the conversation goes. I encourage people to call in. Obviously, you can't do that right now, but we got to take a break. This is the Joshua Vandernoort Show. We'll be right back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Joshua Vandernoort Show. I'm your host, Joshua Vandernoort, here with Zeb. Zeb, how you doing today?
Doing good, making it.
Good deal. So we were talking before the break. We were talking about Hamilton Jeffersonian, the Hamilton Jeffersonian debate, and we started to get off onto, what I define as big government, and I use the example of like rounding up immigrants. Is someone going to get hurt? Yes. Is that a price we're willing to pay to preserve the heart and soul of our nation, preserve literally the blood of our nation? I think so. And we kind of got off into law enforcement, and you brought up an interesting question, which was, if there's a law on the books that isn't being enforced, is it a law? And I thought that was very interesting. My answer is, I think obviously is no. You can write down something as much as you want, but if no one's following it, and if the law isn't being enforced, which is what a law is, then it's not really a law at all. What do you like? Do you care to opine on that?
Yeah, so we've noticed, with the rise of riots and some other things in the recent history of the U.S. On the political front, especially during election season, there's a lack of enforcement of what laws are on the books. And so the question is, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where basically law enforcement isn't allowed to do their job? And it comes with a few things. One of them is socially or culturally, you get canceled or even fired or threat of job and even life sometimes for doing your job, what's on the books, due to the perception of whatever is going on. And I'm not an advocate that all cops are good, and I'm not an advocate that all cops are bad, but we have to take it at face value as it comes. But I would like to maybe go back to the early 90s up until maybe mid 2000s.
Yeah.
The national, well, maybe not national, but the police force across the nation advocated for something called community policing. Community policing is basically encouraging officers to go out during, let's say, Mayfest or parades and interact with the community, to integrate into the community. And so, that's 20 years ago, let's say. And then you had the rise of, we'll just skip on to maybe 2013 and the rise of BLM and the riots. And, we have large names that cause riots across the country, primarily on a racial basis. But the reason that I would argue the reason that happened is because police aren't able to do their jobs because the police, let's say, neutered themselves in creating a horizontal friendship with these people and not a vertical one, right? So law enforcement operates out of respect and fear. And so when you remove that vertical relationship of, oh, he's the police, oh, he's a cop, oh, he's an officer, I need to do whatever I'm told, you remove that vertical relationship and it becomes horizontal of, oh, that's the guy that was at the fair, or that's a officer that played basketball with me, or that's the officer that coached me in Little League. We're friends. It removes that dynamic of enforcer.
Right.
And so once you remove the dynamic of enforcer, you then have a rise of people that do not fear a system that is meant to be respected and feared.
Yeah, that's a
Does
good
that make
point.
sense?
Oh yeah, because I had heard of the community policing programs and like that kind of incentive being passed, but I hadn't really considered that aspect of it because a lot of the people I listen to who talk and think politically, they actually prop that community policing aspect up as a good thing.
Oh, it'll definitely get some pushback, but it doesn't make sense.
That's a good point because it does come down to even thinking about it from the cop's perspective is a cop who is, at the end of the day, he's a human being. If he's interacting with people and he's forming relationships with strangers on the basis that he is enforcing their community, is he going to be able to properly enforce the law if that person he's interacted with comes in conflict with the law? And that's an interesting point because I think obviously the answer would be no. And ultimately, I mean, there's, when you talk about this kind of stuff, there's so many outside factors that go into it. Like you said, there's the racial component of the last few years. There was, it came across before this, but one of the most famous instances was Rodney King. In more recent history, George Floyd, where it, on its face value, the cop was excessive.
Well, I would argue a lot of what today we see on social media through videos or in the courts of officers being not granted qualified immunity. We can argue that. I don't know if qualified immunity is necessary anymore, but that's a deeper conversation. I don't know if that's a direct representation of or consequence of community policing, but I would say that a direct consequence of that is what we saw with riots and a lack of enforcement. And then beyond that is a loss of respect for officers and an increase of potential danger to officers as we see defunding and everything like that. And so once you lose the funds, once you lose those senior officers that are the soul of law enforcement, you then have newer people come in that are less trained because there's less money. They're less qualified because there's less money. And even on the training, even if you did train less qualified people, you still have those less qualified people. So the people that advocate for more training, that's not the problem. The problem is the quality of officer. Just like with a company, if I hire unqualified people, it doesn't matter how much training I give them. At some point, you're not going to have the same company you did prior to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so it's a snowball effect from, again, I would go back to the 90s of community policing and loss of respect for what is a government organization.
Yeah, I do, because like I said before, I think that is a part of it. I think I don't think I would place the blame of the current state of things now with law enforcement solely at the feet of community policing. I definitely think that is that's a pillar in that argument. I definitely think that is a part of it. But to me, when we talk about the black community and the crime issue, which no one disagrees with. I mean, the statistics speak for themselves. I think the figures change so much, but the kind of popular one is I think it was 4 years ago is 13% of the population is considered black, and they commit 50% of violent crimes, and that's just a statistical fact. And the point is where does that come from? And I think, as we were talking about, people having the same culture, people having the same communities, segregation and stuff like that obviously is not ideal. We need to come together. But at the end of the day, like we were talking about, talking about during the break, this sort of sense of white guilt, we need to at one point say, for example, in the black community, which has an issue with crime, is it our fault, or do we have to accept, or do they have to accept responsibility? Just because someone commits a crime, is their upbringing solely to blame for it? Is their situation solely to blame for it? I don't think so.
No, solely no. There are, at some level, there are environmental factors there. I mean, again, we go back to the 90s of community policing. I mean, the 90s, early, mid, maybe even late 90s were peak, let's say, of non-racial disagreements. We had a more cohesive country back then, even without a homogenous society. So, and you see the rates rise recently.
And that's to kind of.
But I'm not throwing statistics out the window. We have to recognize where we are. And maybe even a callback to Hamilton is, when we have society that is made up of multiculturalism, Hamilton's fear was mob rule through democracy. But you can also have mob rule through cultural situations within a society, or even a city or country or state. And so, we're faced with law enforcement that are hurting on numbers, and then you have, let's say, a couple of gangs running around. You can only do so much as an agency to that. And so you run around and you have mob rule, you have riots that are unstoppable. But your question was basically, who's at fault? I would say the in group itself, and this is a problem with every culture, has to hold itself accountable. If there is a standard, that standard should be held across the board. And so I would say
I agree.
Self-accountability, in-group accountability, to the point where out-group accountability isn't necessary would be preferable, but it's obviously not that way. So we would look for in-group accountability, but it's not there. So the question is, what do? You turn to law enforcement, and what happens when law enforcement isn't able to enforce the laws that are on the books?
Yeah, and not getting into like what is the cause of crime in certain communities. It does come down to, like you said, if a law is on the books but not enforced, is it a law at all? And you see this a lot. You see this a lot in places like New York City and Los Angeles, where it's astonishing to me. Oh man, what was the case? There was something recently, but it was basically where someone had committed a crime. I think they had done something, and the DA just let them go. The DA was just like, "Well, we're not going to prosecute him."
Well, it happens often.
Yes. This was like probably 2021. I can't remember the exact case, but that blew my mind. I didn't think that a DA could just not do that.
I would say it's worse on the local level. You have these cops that interact with people on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis, of, people that are on drugs, addicted to heroin or whatever, or you have homeless that are running around sleeping on the streets. We have homeless laws. We have laws against drugs. And these officers will, let's say, arrest them or detain them and take them, and the judge will give them a day, 2 days, maybe a week, but then you see them again. And so at that point, what's the purpose of the officer even taking them in? It's just a waste of time if they're going to be there tomorrow. And so that's the same issue.
And now we started with Christian nationalism, got into Hamiltonianism and Jeffersonianism, and now we're getting into law enforcement, which I'm fine with. But that brings up another topic that I've thought of, and before we got to wrap up here in a few minutes, so I want to get your thoughts before we go. Me personally, I want to get your take on this. I think we need to reevaluate the judicial system, especially when it comes to judges. I think judges get way too much authority for what they're worth these days. I mean, I don't have any names off the top of my head, but it wouldn't be too hard to find judges in New York, in Los Angeles, and all these liberal Democrat cities that are quite literally letting people go. And when I say people, I don't mean the kid who filled his pockets at the candy store and got caught for it. I'm talking about rapists and violent offenders are being let go.
Yeah, well, there's an immunity that judges have, and some of them are appointed, and that you can point to that issue. But even the elected do the same thing. They almost have an immunity to the consequences of their actions, right? So if we have violent offenders that go to prison, let's say they commit a outright murder, right? And they give, let's say they let them off scot-free, or they give them a week. Let's say they give them 2 years, and they get out and they reoffend. I don't know if the judges should be held accountable, but there should be some consequence of action to a repetitive judge that allows citizens to be taken advantage of with respect to their actions that they took on someone else because they're scared to hurt feelings.
I think it's fair to say, okay, this guy was arrested. A judge gave him this sentencing. He got out and did it again. Okay, are we going to blame the judge for that? No. But if you can, all this stuff is written down.
Well, one time is one thing, but you'll have judges do it 5 or 6 times with the same person.
Exactly. Yes, that
and
to me
many
is
times they're illegal.
Yeah, that's exactly my problem. Is you get these goofy old fogies going up there in their little gowns and their stupid hats and their little hammers, and to me that's like a LARP territory where like that would be if I came in with some hoodlum handcuffed and I came in with a cowboy hat and a 6-shooter because I'm a bounty hunter. Like that's where that's kind of encroaching on to me. But that's exactly my point. Is like they have their level of immunity that like what the judges are getting away with these days does not warrant what they've been allowed to do in the past.
Yeah, I'm not.
And that's what I say by reevaluation is I'm not saying that we get rid of judges. I'm not one of these kooks. But what I'm saying is,
well, you're just acknowledging that there's a loss of trust in the system.
Yes.
In the judicial system.
Exactly.
And I think that's shared across the board.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in the same direction.
Of course.
But it is shared across the board. Something's going to have to give eventually. I don't know if a reshaping of the judicial system is in the way of that initially, but eventually it will have to happen.
Of course. Well, we're about to come up at the end of the show. Is there anything in all of the discussions we've had today that you want to put kind of a final cap on? Any final words you wanted to say before we get out of here?
I mean, not really. I just want to thank you for having me on the show. I want to thank the radio for hosting me, and thank you for all the listeners out there. I would advocate for a Hamiltonian perspective during the Ken Dr. Bolt conversation.
Well, he listens to my show, so maybe he'll hear this and he'll think to have you on. But well, we'll see how that goes.
We'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll get it. I'm not a history professor, so maybe I'll get it handed to me. But I would advocate for a more nationalistic society.
All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Zeb.
Thank you.
Good deal. This has been the Joshua Vandernoord Show. I am your host, Joshua Vandernoord, and I'll catch you guys next week. Thank you for listening. Like I said, that was a pre-record. This was Zeb and I's first appearance together on the radio waves, and a lot has happened since then. We started outside the Overton, and now I'm doing my own show. And we got all these other projects going on, and I'm excited about the future. But I will be live next week with call-ins, reaction content. Excited to be back with you on the Joshua Vandernoort Show. Thank you for listening.